That's what you'll log into the Zoom with. Because I think you have to be logged into a Zoom account in order to click the link. You have to have a. Two questions for you. Hold on one second.
Yeah. Well, welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection. There we go. There we go. We're letting people in now. They're getting started. We are going to be having a conversation today about history and a critical thinking approach to history. Now, last week we did talk about history and not history. We talked about critical thinking and why that's important. And this is a kind of an extension to that. We're going to be talking with a historian, Raffi. I don't know if it's you that's the owner, but if it is, would you open your mic? Because that's the only name I don't recognize. And owner is not a name that I recognize. So I don't know, who is owner. That's always those mysterious people. We always worry about them, that they're not the people who want to just do a Zoom bombing or something like that, So we don't know. Owner is mysterious, and we're always suspect of those guys. And the no-name people, anonymous people. But at any rate, I want to have a conversation, or we expect to have a conversation with a person who has been producing and shows, streaming TV shows, doing things like public speaking on this subject of history and how people remember history. What is involved in having a historical conversation, or a conversation that's historical. So if our guest shows up, we'll bring them into that conversation. Otherwise, we will start a conversation ourselves about history and how do we have an objective appraisal of history. I think it's worthwhile pointing out, if for those of you who weren't here last week, that history is kind of his story. It's like somebody wrote down something, usually kind of self-aggrandizement about themselves, and then historians go and pick up little pieces, letters and things like that, and from that they try to reconstruct what actually happened. And I'm speaking of people who are trying to create history in an honest way, what actually happened. But it can never, oh, there's Raffi. History can never be anything more than the collection of stories for basic data. And then we kind of look at that data and reinterpret it, okay? But it has to start off with the data. Welcome, Raffi.
Hey there.
I like your haircut, man. I think I'm gonna let my hair grow out so I can do that. But then I probably need to get a different tie too. To go with my haircut,
That's right.
You're looking good, man. How you doing?
Thanks. Good. How are you?
Good. Sorry we had a kind of a problem hooking up, but
I caught me when I was flying, man. It was kind of a crazy. It was hard. I had a very narrow window.
I was actually in on a car. I wasn't flying, but other people might disagree. So I'd like to start off by having you give us a little background about yourself, so that'll help our panel here to understand where you're coming from. So can you give us where you're born, the struggles you had in junior high school, understanding yourself. Well, who are you? And then how you get into history.
So you want me to start for me?
Yes, yeah. You're the star of the show, man.
Okay. Well, so obviously I'm Raffi Andonian. I am often on TV as a celebrity historian. That's the term that's been going around. So I bought celebrityhistorian.com.
Oh, okay. There you go.
But I grew up in LA. I grew up in Los Angeles. That's where I was born and raised. I moved around quite a bit after graduating high school. So I grew up in one place, but I lived in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Virginia, New Mexico, and now I live in St. Louis. And I moved around for a variety of reasons: school, working at historic sites, different things. And so I guess since you want a story from our youth, and that's relevant here, and how I got into history, so when I was in third grade, we were reading some stuff about American history and the Constitution and this and that. And what happened is I kind of looked at some of the pictures and whatever the narrative was, I can't remember exactly, but I know I was captured by the story. And so I asked my parents if we can go to the East Coast. Remember, I'm in LA, right? That's where I was growing up.
Sure. Yeah.
And check out some of these sites. Well, I was fortunate enough that 2 years later, when I was in fifth grade, we did go as a family to Philadelphia and some other East Coast sites. And I remember I was really fascinated by the row houses and just the historic area that's there. Of course, we went to Independence Hall, but I actually remember the row houses in the district more than I remember Independence Hall. So that's when I was hooked. And by the time I got to college, I started an internship. I was in college in Pennsylvania, and I started an internship at Gettysburg, the big Civil War battlefield, which then started a string of jobs that I got, including at Gettysburg. So I went back for several summers as a park ranger at Gettysburg, doing historical interpretation around the battlefield for 6 summers. I also had 1 summer at Richmond National Battlefield Park, which is a Confederate, of course, the former Confederate capital, but of course now is National Park Service. So it has a series of sites, battlefields, and medical site and industrial site that are part of one national park. And then I worked at the Martin Luther King home down in Atlanta, Georgia, while I was going to graduate school at the University of Georgia. And then after that, I went to Los Alamos, New Mexico, and worked in Los Alamos where the atomic bomb was created. So I've got a chance to interact with a lot of really big historical themes, whether it's the Civil War and slavery, to, of course, civil rights with Martin Luther King, and then, of course, with the atomic bomb, and and that all that entails. And when I was in Los Alamos, and so as a result, I mean, one of my topics that I've been fascinated by, that's one of the topics that I, presented as a scholar for this program, was contested historic sites. How do we talk about, how do we tackle, how do we understand these contested historic sites? I've worked at a major Civil War battlefield, which everything that entails. I mean, I think Civil War politics are still with us. The Confederate capital in Richmond. I worked at Martin Luther King home, as I described, and Los Alamos with the atomic bomb. I mean, people love it, hate it. It's incredible, the lightning rod that can be too. But from a history standpoint, how do we talk about these historical issues and historical events and try to understand them, and kind of, all that entails. So that's kind of my journey as to how I fell onto that. Now, one of my other topics is the debate on the Constitution. As I mentioned, that was how I initially started to like history. And I find the debates on the Constitution very relevant today. I mean, you can see everything going on in the Supreme Court and all these issues. But one of the things that I stand for is I'm not an advocate. I'm not an advocate for saying, well, this group or that political group has it right or wrong. I'm more someone that tries to see the rich layers in both of these areas and issues, because I think all of these things have multiple perspectives, and there can be multiple perspectives that are valid because all these things have changed over time. I mean, the Constitution, for example, has been debated since the founding fathers wrote the darn thing, and they were debating it amongst themselves. They couldn't even agree on it. So, I mean, how are we going to agree on it? You know what I mean? So I think that if people understand that these issues and sites and symbols have multiple angles and layers, it kind of diffuses the situation a little bit so that we can at least try to understand each other a little better before we want to strangle each other over historical narratives. You know what I mean? So
yeah, assuming that we actually want to understand each other and we wouldn't prefer just
that's the challenge, right?
Discussion.
So that's why I try to make things entertaining. I have, like if you look at some of my TV clips I've done, I do try to make it a little bit, I don't want to say I lighten the situation. Sometimes I'm talking about big topics, but I do try to make it fun and engaging to help people pull in. So it's just trying to be creative and also trying to be balanced and trying to be, I think, not alienating in the way you communicate, you know what I mean? And that tends to open a lot of people up. Now, I'll just share one more thing that was really a highlight. Last Tuesday, so 2 days ago, I was in Alabama, and yesterday, Wednesday, I was coming back from rural Alabama, and I was in Selma, and many of you may know Selma was, of course, the site for Bloody Sunday in 1965, famous march attempt that ended with brutal police beatings. And, Martin Luther King was not there on Bloody Sunday, but he was there for the follow-up marches. But it kind of doesn't matter because there was a local organization that was working for years prior to King even being connected to that. And John Lewis was there, who of course recently passed away. But I got to interview Joanne Bland, who was one of the leaders, the local leaders, as a 12, 13-year-old at the time, because these kids got involved from age 7 or 8 with their older siblings and parents. Her older sister, for example, was the youngest person to complete the march. Her older sister was 14 at the time, and Joanne was maybe 12. And I got to interview her in her living room, talking about her experiences around, before, during, and after Bloody Sunday. And she was just so candid and raw, and it was really fascinating. And, it was something that I went there in person for because I thought it was valuable to have that intimacy. And we had a live audience for it, and it was really fascinating and she really opened up. And that's what I was up to. I marched Selma to Montgomery Bridge a few times, just kind of like taking it in. Got to hang out with her for several hours, did the program. And that's the journey that, this has taken me on, which is really, really kind of it was really a treat to get to do that with her. You know what I mean?
Yes. And I think that's where we're at now with history, is trying to get those people who actually have firsthand accounts, and then take those firsthand accounts and then make sense of it so that it's utilizable to us. How can, because if it's just cocktail talk, then to me, it's kind of useless. I need to be able to say, well, what does that inform me about where I am now? And how does it connect me, not just to the past, but what do I want to do in the future? Where do I see this trajectory, this path? And where am I on that path? So can you talk to us a little bit about that kind of thing? How does history, or how could history inform us as to how to be one, better people, and also better citizens?
Man, that's a huge question, and I love it. So there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, of course, with having just talked with Joanne Bland, right? And by the way, speaking of being better citizens, and you're trying to connect it to informing us today, I want to point out that Joanne Bland is about the age of my mother. She's not ancient. You know what I'm saying? This stuff is not long ago. And she's actually younger than my father. And they're both still alive. My parents are both still alive. So I mean, that gives you an idea of yeah, those photos might look black and white, but this stuff isn't long ago. You know what I mean? So that means that people my parents' age, had my parents been born in this country, and my parents are immigrants, but let's say my parents were born in this country, or let's say for my peers, right, who have parents in the same age group, were raised in segregated schools. Think about that.
Yeah.
And how that shapes who you are, no matter how much I think you set it behind you, it's just foundational because you're a kid. You know what I mean? And so I would say that remembering that these historical themes continue, and it doesn't always give us a clear answer, but it gives us first the awareness and understanding so we know how to tackle it. Because I'll give you, let me step back a little further. Some of the themes that play out in the 1960s. Now remember, I worked at a Civil War site and then a Civil Rights site, but they're very much carry over from the days of slavery into civil rights. So And then when you consider that this era is not long ago, as I just described, these echoes are still there in many ways. And we can get into, if you want, how they are. But to me, understanding that is really valuable. And that's true for so many issues. I mean, not just the issue of civil rights. For example, the debates on the Constitution we were just talking about, right? I mean, we seem to think that these debates are new because, I don't know, I hate this group and that group is trying to make an issue. Well, actually, you know, these debates were always happening. These issues were always happening. So I just think that we forget that. So I guess to answer your question, how do we become better citizens? Number one, we know that these things happen. If we know that these things happen, Joanne Bland, one of the things she said, because I posed a question to her. I said, what do you say to people that say we're no better off on civil rights today than we were back then because we still have some issues? And she said, you don't know your history if you say that.
Exactly.
Because she said, I couldn't sit at a counter when I was a kid. Now I can. She said, I couldn't, you know, I couldn't imagine a Black mayor. Now we have a Black mayor in Selma, Alabama, which still has issues, don't get me wrong. But she was saying, and by the way, when President Obama went to Selma to do the march in 2008 and in 2015, 2008 was on the campaign trail, 2015 was for the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in 1965. Both times you see Joanne Bland arm in arm with President Obama, okay? So she said she wasn't voting for Obama until Obama came and won her over with his charisma in 2008. But what's interesting is, which by the way, she doesn't remember the first person she voted for though when she was younger. So it's kind of funny, right? People don't know they're making history until later and they look back and they can't remember everything. But what's interesting is that, to me, is that, and the reason I bring that up is because she said, I couldn't imagine a moment where I'd be marching across a bridge with a Black president, right? And so these are her words. And so I guess what I'm saying is, it informs us because I think on the one hand, we go a little too far when we say, well, nothing's better because we still have some issues to deal with. Well, you don't have a context because these folks, when they, when you, if you want, you listen to the interview of what happened with her, there's no way you can say that. But as she says too, there's still stuff that we can work on, but you have to also see the sacrifices that folks like Joanne Bland and others made to make the progress that they did. So I think that's one way. The other way, I think, Lawrence, is understanding that these issues have multiple sides. Even folks in the civil rights movement, for example, since we're on that topic, did not agree on how to approach civil rights. We, in historical memory, tend to think of Martin Luther King, and I think we kind of have a very superficial vision, like it's some vague notion of equality and freedom that he stands for. Okay, like what does that actually mean? If you kind of dig into it a little bit, it's pretty painful. But also, at the time, we forget at the time that by a lot of the folks that were against him, they saw him as an agitator. And the folks that were, let's call it, on the side of civil rights were not necessarily saying that Martin Luther King is the guy to lead us, because there were different philosophies, different approaches, different ways of doing things. So I guess what I'm saying there is that there's never been agreement across these across the spectrum. And when we look at the Constitution, for example, with all the constitutional debates going on now, one of which, by the way, on the docket for the Supreme Court this year is on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which passed as a result of the Selma to Montgomery March. I mean, directly, you can connect it to that. So some of us owe the ability to vote thanks to the Voting Rights Act, which passed because of the Selma to Montgomery March. I mean, King was jailed after the march and wrote a letter from a Selma jail, which got President Johnson's attention and started the motion towards the Voting Rights Act. So my point is that these issues are still with us, right? And these debates are still with us. And I would ask people to be better citizens, to not only know where we came from, but to realize that there's more than one way to look at something. Yes. And to realize that when you get informed with history, you find that it's usually more nuanced and complicated than you initially believe. And that complication, to me, allows you to say, you know what, there's more than one way to see this. Let me breathe before I jump and you know, say, no, if you don't agree with this, then you are blah, some kind of label. You know what I mean? I would rather see that, hey, these issues have been debated, and there's plenty of folks that have good intentions or acting in good faith that have different interpretations. And before we label, I think the problem in our citizen society right now is we're polarized, and we kind of think automatically we have our mind made up. And one of the ways I see history used this way is we tend to quote historical figures like Dr. King or Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, or, you know, some of these major figures. Frederick Douglass has been popping up recently in the last couple of years. I feel like 3-4 years ago, nobody knew who Frederick Douglass was. Now suddenly everyone knows who Frederick Douglass is.
Yeah.
But they misquote him all the time. I mean, I've read these original sources. I mean, I knew Frederick Douglass since I was in high school. Like, he was one of my childhood heroes, you know, and eventually I started studying him more from a scholarship standpoint. But my point is that same with Jefferson. You know, he was one of my childhood heroes too. And that's another thing. You don't have to be all one or all another. Like, you can see people's faults. You can still have multiple people that you admire for different reasons. And I think if we would just try to learn something that we don't already agree with, I think that would be very powerful. Because otherwise what you do is you go in, you pull out a line or a paragraph out of context, and you say, see, King agrees with me,
Right.
or Frederick Douglass agrees with me, or Jefferson agrees with me. So what? First of all,
You
you
know,
made that document, and secondly, there are other people that were peers that were on the same side or friends with them or in the same circle or whatever it is, who disagreed. So who's right? Like, we just have to continue to understand that these are perfectly fine debates to have rather than killing each other.
Well, you know, that brings up the opportunity to look at the resistances. In other words, you'll have someone who says, hey, look, we want to have voting rights too. And then there are people who really feel threatened with that idea. And one of the things that I think we don't pay enough attention to is the emotional investment that people have in other people being oppressed. You know, it's like if you don't recognize, like, okay, what is this brother or sister struggle with somebody else? What do they need out of it? You know, what are they feeling? Where does the threat come from? It's not that you agree with them, but if you don't understand, like, okay, this is hard for them, you know. And I recently, well, I say recently, the last 5 or 10 years, I came to understand, for example, that when someone decides that if they grow up in a racist society and they decide that that's it for them, they're not going to go that route anymore. They want to be non-racist. What I came to understand is what it costs them to not be racist. If everybody you know is racist, your mama's racist, your daddy's racist, all your friends are racist, your church is racist, your school is racist. If you decide not to become racist, you essentially are on your own.
That's
you don't
right.
know anybody who's not racist. Even if they pretend not to be, you know they are, because you sit around and hear their conversations around the dinner table. And if you decide not to be racist, you're on your own. And then since you were racist, now the people that you say, well, I'm going to go on that side now, they're not talking to you because you have history of like
That's
saying,
right.
oh, that guy's racist. They're not letting that go. And maybe even did some racist acts. Nobody's going to be ready to forgive that real easy because you woke up, you know, this morning and said, I'm done with that now. I want to be somebody else.
Well,
Who's going to help you to be something else? I think
it-
that's part of the historical story too.
that's right. That's a good point. And can I add something? If I can add something to that, I think that, you know, when we think of it, that even when you decide to leave it behind, it's not that simple. I think because it's around us, it's in the water, right? So, and again, I think there are plenty of well-meaning people that, you know, don't always agree on everything. But the thing is that I think we have to acknowledge that to varying degrees, depending on exactly what your life situation is and where you are, et cetera, you can't say that. And I'll give you what I mean by that. Like, I grew up in LA, in Los Angeles, right? And I grew up in an environment that is very predominantly Hispanic, and especially a lot of Mexican immigrants. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't share with you that I was definitely in an environment, just in general, like in Southern California, which I think still continues today. I mean, I grew up basically in the 90s and early 2000s in LA, that definitely looks down upon Mexicans, okay? And as a child, going back to this segregated school stuff, right? I was not in segregated school per se, but you can't say that it doesn't affect you when you hear this stuff all around you. But some of the moments I remember are like my dad, for example, who hired a day laborer, and he was an undocumented immigrant. You know, there's kind of these areas where you could find folks and hire them for the day. And you pay cash and they help you on labor. But I remember the car ride. I was a kid. I don't remember how old, but I was pretty young. And I remember in the car ride, I was with him because I was to help out, I guess, whatever we were doing. And on the car ride, remember, my dad's an immigrant too, right? Different place, and I remember in the car ride that the Mexican man that was in there, that he shared that he was undocumented. But as he talked about his family, because we were talking about it was just like a normal, getting to know you conversation. I was just kind of struck by how he sounded like us. You know what I'm saying? So it goes to show, and I remember my dad also not taking advantage of the situation, because you could say, well, I'm going to pay you whatever I want, and they have no recourse.
Or not pay.
Exactly. And so then I remember he did that, and I remember that impression that it left on me, that you don't take advantage of someone just because of that situation, and also it humanized them. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's easy to be in an environment where if you don't get to know someone, right? And this is why like intermixing is so important in terms of having an environment that you're exposed to different kinds of people.
Yes.
Because it's easier to hate what you don't know, right? But as you get to know them, you might see, you know what, that actually kind of sounds like me. There might be some cultural differences, but there are some themes that really connect on a human level, right? And then of course you got to have moments that you remember, such as what I described, but it certainly affects you when you're around that environment, even today. And I'm not afraid to admit that. And so you have to be aware and conscious to deal with that, I think, so that, because I just think that to pretend that you don't see this stuff, you're fooling yourself, because it's built around us. You know what Joanne Bland said, if I go on the black side of town and the white side of town, and I can tell the difference without you telling me, then we have a problem.
Then we have a problem.
And that's all it takes. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I think this is the kind of struggle that we're in, is as we're making history, we learn history, but we're also making history. And as we're making that history, like, what kind of history are we going to make? So at this point, I'd like to kind of open it up to our esteemed panel for any, how can I say, questions, responses, comments that they might have on the issue of history, our taking history and making history.
As you do that, I'm going to grab something right here. Take me 2 seconds that I think is relevant to conversation.
Okay.
Go ahead. I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead. Anybody?
I'm back.
Okay. Sharon, she escaped, I pointed a finger at her and she left. No, there she is. She came back. She got her courage. Oh, okay. She has a good note. Okay, why don't you go ahead, Raffi, and if anybody else, if you have something that a comment you want to make, a question you want to make, open your mic or raise your hand or do one of those things, and then I'll keep looking. And if I miss it, somebody point it out to me. Go ahead, Raffi. You said
I was going to say, what's really fascinating to me, we were talking about historic sites and symbols and, all the different perspectives. So I've been doing a series of TV segments on this coin that's out, this quarter that's out now, or multiple quarters. This is a George Washington, obviously on the front, it's the quarter. And this is actually, it's not silver. I know they're really shiny, but they're untouched quarters. So I got this direct from the US Mint.
Hmm.
And then on the back side is the 5 quarters that are out this year for the different historic women. I've done segments on 3 of them. So there's the 5 women are Maya Angelou, who of course was a poet and performer, activist. Dr. Sally Ride, who is the first American woman in space. Some of you all may remember her. Wilma Mankiller, who was the first female principal chief of Cherokee Nation. Nina Otero Warren, who's in from New Mexico, was a women's suffragist, but was also the first Latina candidate for Congress. And Anna Mae Wong, who's a Hollywood star from the silent film days, and the first Asian American. And she's what's really fascinating is just a lot of the stereotyping she had to deal with in the casts, and she went back to China for a little bit and came back. I mean, all this incredible story.
First Asian American woman who did what? Because she wasn't the first Asian American woman.
No. Hollywood star, first Asian American Hollywood star.
Okay.
and she has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And she is, you could kind of find some old YouTube video, some old footage of her on YouTube if you want to look. It's really fascinating. But these 5 women are part of the American Women Quarters program that the US Mint is doing. There's a first year of 4 years. So they're doing 5 a year for 4 years, so 20 total. But here's why this is really interesting to me. There's 2 sides to every coin, right? And what's really cool to this is me. I was talking about Thomas Jefferson and Frederick Douglass earlier. To me, this kind of reminds me of that you have space for both. You don't have to get rid of George Washington to be able to talk about these folks too, right? There's room for both. It's not, to me, an either or. I'd rather see a game of addition where we can talk about George Washington and, some of his achievements, along with the achievements of folks like these that are on here, right? And so to me, it's kind of a cool symbol that symbolizes that there are multiple sides and multiple ways to see things, and we can play addition and not subtraction, because I don't think either one is right. Like, we don't have to, say George Washington is a terrible guy in order to hold up Maya Angelou. You can like both for different reasons. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's really valuable to remember.
See, I think that what happened. Oh, go ahead, Sharon. You got to turn on your mic.
Mute.
You got to unmute. Sharon, you got to unmute.
Maybe we should let Raffi finish his sentence, I think, and then I'll come in.
I was finished.
No,
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, when you, Raffi, mentioned the Civil War, I thought of this beautiful poem. I did not write it, but it shows both sides equally. And I would like to read it. I am going to read it, unless I'm muted. It's written by R.T. Smith. I think he's a Virginian. And it's in the voice of Henry Kidd Douglas after Cold Harbor, which I assume is a place where there was a battle.
Yeah, I worked at Battlefield. Yeah, it's part of the Richmond National Battlefield Park. Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. It fits in then. Here it is. It is not war that makes us mortal, nor courage that sows this subtraction, but something infernal in the design that rises when the skirmish line, just after a volley, wavers and thins, then writes the colors and closes ranks, while shells whistle over demented, and trees burst into furried flame. The stench of seared horseflesh and spent powder haunts the air. This morning, sweeping my long glass across a hillside, surveying to assess last night's damage, I realized I could tell our pitiful dead from the Federals at a fair distance in high summer, as they, the Federals, were well fed and full of juices, while our starved volunteers are all sinew and sparse gristle, still intact as they festoon the bitter field. The northern lads swell and suppurate, though it did not escape my notice listening to the rear guard's rifles and hearing artillery's random retort, that the azure butterflies lured from the forest show no bias and alight on the upturned faces of either army's fallen boys to sip the ichor from their eyes.
Awesome. Now, I will say that, when was that poem written? What year?
Well, he was born in 1974, and of course, Henry Kidd Douglas would have been alive during 1960. R.T. Smith, the poet, was born in 1974, and the voice he is using here would have been in sometime between 1863 and 1865.
Gotcha. Of course, I know Henry Kidd Douglas, yeah, but I know you told me the poet was
R.T. Smith.
yeah, okay.
I mean, the initials are T.
Yeah, now I will say, I think some of it plays a little bit into some of what's called the lost cause narrative. Now, the lost cause narrative is comes up after the war, not during the war, but after the war. There's certain tenets, this sort of, we were doomed to lose the war because the North had more resources and we didn't, and it does play a little bit into that, to me, it's a great example of historical memory, because I think there's a difference between the history and the memory. The memory is sort of how we remember things. It doesn't matter if we were personally there or not, but like I was just talking about, for example, you're touching on, for example, the Civil War memory, but I talked about memory on MLK. You know what I mean? I don't remember MLK, but we all have some notion. So what's interesting to me about that piece is it's not just what it tries to depict, but it's the way it's depicting it and the lens it's coming from is itself a way of analyzing, well, how are people remembering the Civil War and how are they interpreting it and dealing with it? Because I would point out that across eras and across generations, the meaning of the Civil War changes. So, I mean, the Civil War itself didn't change, but our lens through which we look at it changes across time. And one great example of that is, of course, the Confederate battle flag. It has multiple ways and uses. In multiple ways, it's been used, I guess, to have different meanings. This is part of the reason we fight over it. And usually I tell people, well, all those different meanings, all of them are true, because all of them it's been used in all these different ways. You know what I mean? Sometimes benignly, sometimes not so benignly, certainly meant to, mean a certain negative message, sometimes more historically, because it's a historic context. All those things have been true. Sometimes as a symbol of rebellion. It has nothing to do with the South sometimes, like when you see it sometimes on these old trucks, for example, or motorcycle rallies. So there's all these different symbols. All of them can be true. So it's, when someone yells and says, well, it means this, you're wrong, it doesn't mean that. I would say, no, you're wrong too, because it means all those things, because it's been used in all those ways. You know what I mean? So that's a great example of trying to understand these different perspectives. Now, my point here, though, as it pertains to your poem, is the flag's meaning, as well as other things, start to change across generations as we have a memory of the Civil War. Usually that has to do more with the present that you're in than it has to do with the past, because we tend to look through the lens of what we see around us to interpret the past to bring us to today. And that's one of the biggest challenges to overcome. You know what I mean? It's very difficult.
I think that he is using the lens of today to say that all of these boys who were killed, they're dead, and the butterflies don't find any difference in them there.
Yeah. I mean, I would look. That's one way to look at. I mean, because I see what I heard when I heard that was sort of the well-fed Federals and the starving Confederates, which is kind of a, I don't know if that's necessarily always as true as people kind of make it in memory. You know what I mean? And so I guess it depends on how you're seeing it.
Yeah, he needed that though to make the difference between the butterflies non-biased.
Sure.
Starving or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. more
And
diverse.
also what's interesting about that, Sharon, is that that gets at a difference between the soldiers and the leaders. So for example, a lot of soldiers on both sides fought actually for similar reasons. Like their brother went to war, so they go with him, or, you know, they're going to protect their state and this and that.
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean that the presidents aren't standing for different things. So there is a difference, you know, and people kind of have a hard time understanding it sometimes. But I would point out, even to today, not everyone that's in the military is in the military because of a certain cause. What the president does with the army is a different thing than the reasons that people choose to join the military.
Right.
And so we have to understand that too. Now, it doesn't mean that every soldier doesn't have a cause. No, but it means that there is a rich array of different answers, right? And so what that, to me, what I hear in that also, Sharon, is yes, once you talk about the butterflies, once they're dead, I mean, a lot of these soldiers are surprisingly similar on both sides. You know what I mean? They're farmers, they're, you know, family ties, or generally their whole life was local, you know, within a 50-mile radius. But it doesn't mean you don't have some soldiers that do have ideologies in there too. They do. But again, it's a wide array, but it doesn't change what the leadership fought for, right? So there's these differences to kind of, there's all these nuances to consider there.
Mhm.
I think that works for all of us. It's like most of us have like a limited number of people we know, and limited number of things we know, a limited number of emotional connections we have to various issues. And we see issues through that lens, you know. I am struck by the observation that was brought to me recently, that every human being, in your eye, there's a blind spot, you know, that just comes with the eye. You can't get away from it. But when we look at things, we're not aware of that blind spot, you know, and so that really affects not only how we physically look at things, but the interpretation of how we look at things. And I think that in our daily lives, vis-a-vis history, there are always blind spots. But we think we're seeing the whole thing dynamically. Colby,
Yeah,
you
that's
had
a good
you were
point.
gonna say?
Let me just add one quick thing before, and I know Colby has a question. Here's something that's funny to me, is that some of these soldiers fought because they were getting better pay than they would at home. And that's true on both sides. You know, so sometimes it's that simple. Sometimes it's grandiose, but sometimes it's that simple, right? Sometimes it is ideological and sometimes it's not. And you know, so I admire that butterfly part, Sharon, where it's trying to kind of get at that concept. You know what I mean? So so yeah, pretty cool. And as far as blind spots, I just want to say real quick that it's not even when we refer to history, Lawrence. Sometimes we're referring to history and we don't even know it. And what I mean by that is, think about how many times in our rhetoric we talk about XYZ is what this country is about. Well, you cannot have a notion of what this country is about without having some perception of what you think its historical roots are. Maybe accurate, inaccurate. It might be because of a movie. It doesn't have to be because it doesn't matter. But the point is you have some perception. And so you're already necessarily dealing with a historical topic without even realizing. You know what I mean? So, all right, sorry. Go ahead, Colby. I know you have a question.
Thank you, Raffi. I really appreciate the analogy you gave with the coins. That was really powerful, and from my perspective. And Sharon, thank you for reading the poem as well.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, actually, I don't have a question. I just wanted to make I guess, a comment or an observation. So, you know, one analogy I am drawing from this conversation is right here in South Dakota. So I grew up in the Black Hills, and you know, we all are, you know, South Dakota is very well known, obviously, for Mount Rushmore, probably more than anything else. So we have, you know, millions of tourists that literally come to the Black Hills every year to see Mount Rushmore and all of the sites on that side of the state. But we also have a mountain that is actually literally the world's largest mountain carving in progress, known as Crazy Horse. And again, many people obviously come to see that as well, because its proximity to Mount Rushmore is, you know, they're just a few miles apart. But one thing that is interesting to me as I think about that is, and just a little more background, I had the opportunity for about 7 summers from about 2012 to 2018 or so to drive the airport shuttle for the Rapid City Airport. And so, of course, I got to meet many, many people coming from anywhere and everywhere, including, many other countries. And it was really a fascinating experience, and I reflect on that a lot. But I had many, many questions, from the people who I would pick up and take from the airport to wherever they were going. But one thing and it gave me an opportunity to share a little bit about, what I knew about the Black Hills area. But one thing that's really interesting to me is the highest point for many, many years in the Black Hills was known as Harney Peak, and it's actually as I understand it, the highest point east of the Rocky Mountains, 7,242 feet or something like that. Well, here just a few years ago, the name was changed from Harney Peak to Black Elk Peak. And the reason for that change primarily is because the person, Harney, for whom it was previously named, was someone who, when you go back and you study history, was really responsible for a lot of devastation among the native people, murdering people and all of that. And so, but, for me personally, that wasn't something I hadn't necessarily gone back and studied Harney until I heard all of that discussion going on. And then just going back to the Crazy Horse and Mount Rushmore thing. So a lot of people admire those, but also even within our own state, there are people who are not necessarily happy that, those are there. Some people, for example, look at that as sort of tearing up, if you will, the natural beauty of the Black Hills or whatever. So you have differing perspectives on those as well, even right here in the, among the people who live in the area. And so it's just really fascinating to me. And so that's why I really especially appreciate your comment you just made, Raffi, about, to have some idea of what this country is about. You have to realizing that everyone kind of comes at it from a particular angle. So we just have to really be aware of that and understand that, like your coin example, there are always 2 sides to every story. And
I'd say even more than 2. Yeah. If the
Yeah,
coin could be
exactly.
multidimensional, it'd be even better,
like
right?
a diamond, right? Yes. So anyway, thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of things I would add to that is that, first of all, I love that you brought up Mount Rushmore. And in my larger talk on contested sites, I do have a part on that. And because it's a great example of history versus memory. And memory is how we choose to remember history. And usually memory is shaped more by, I would say, pop culture and folklore. So movies, political rhetoric, paintings. I mean, a great example is the Declaration of Independence being signed. You all seen that painting, and there's a ceremony in that room where everyone signed it. Never happened. So it actually was signed over the course of about 6 weeks as people trickled in, you know what I mean? So that's memory, right? And so all that is stuck in our head right now. So I guess, history and memory are kind of a funny thing, right? But so we're fighting now, I think, a lot of our memory, I think. And I think these name changes, it's about how we remember something. It doesn't change the stories necessarily. And everything to me is about context. So Mount Rushmore is certainly a project of memory that's trying to depict history, right? Because there is a particular group that chooses who to memorialize on there and what stories to tell. I do like that in the example you gave, Colby, that there's a game of addition being played rather than subtraction. I prefer that, generally speaking. But of course, everything is case by case. You know what I mean? Because there are always exceptions to rules, and sometimes it's a little overt. I'll give you an example that might surprise you with Joanne Bland. So of course, the bridge that was there and still is the Edmund Pettus Bridge that they attempted to march across and ultimately did after multiple attempts. The Edmund Pettus is a KKK leader. He was a KKK leader. And that's who that bridge is named after. And someone apparently started an effort a number of years back to change the name from Edmund Pettus Bridge. And this is what Joanne Bland said. She said, nobody bothered to ask us locally. It was someone from, I don't know where, and they wanted to name it John Lewis Bridge. And John Lewis said, I don't want it named after me. I wasn't the only one there. Well, and I said, do you want it changed? And she said, no, because I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And that term has now come to mean a name, a symbol associated with freedom. And she said, Edmund Pettus rolls over in his grave every time we march across it for freedom. And I found that fascinating because that was an example where that same name or symbol now got redefined, right? It got redefined, its meaning changed. And I think sometimes someone said something earlier, might have been Lawrence or Sharon, nobody, that reminded me of this too, is that nobody bothered to ask what these folks want. We just sometimes think that we know what they want from wherever our position and our lens is, right? And I found that really powerful, you know, in that situation. So these issues are very nuanced and complex, you know what I mean? And I just did a TV segment on Monday. So the day before I was in Alabama, I was in New Mexico. And I did a TV segment on the holiday, which is known as Indigenous People Day / Columbus Day, depending on what state you're in. And I covered the Pueblo Revolt, which is the only successful American Indian uprising against a colonial power in the colonial period. And it happened in New Mexico. That's why I was there. But I thought it was a great way to remember the conflict, right? And now this whole naming thing over Columbus Day versus Indigenous Day, that's a great example of memory. It's a darn holiday that has like no historic significance in terms of what actually happened on that day. But it is a fight over how we choose to remember the colonial period. So it's a great example of a, you know, dispute over historical memory, right? So now, does that name situation directly connect to that of Joanne Bland with the Edmund Pettus Bridge? No, because they're totally different contexts. One was a site of an event, and that name has kind of changed. The other one is the name of a holiday. So there is no one answer for all these situations either, right? So.
Well, I think it's useful to remember that remember means to remember, to put the pieces back together.
Yeah.
And then there are different kinds of remembering, depending on who is remembering the thing. So you have an institutional memory where groups maybe get together and they have a history, and they, because of the focus of their group, they tend to put all the pieces together in one way. The individual, as many times as you remember it, you actually reassemble that thought or that event. So it never can come together quite like it was. It's kind of like when you dig a hole and then you try to put the dirt back in, you'll notice that it doesn't fit back in the same way.
Right.
So you can never fill the hole and it looks like it was never built, you know? I mean, no matter how much you stamp or whatever,
Right.
you can go over that and say there was a hole was dug here, even though they tried to put it back and they planted grass and stuff, there was a hole here, you know? So I think in the same way, we can't ever put the dirt back like it originally was. So we try to interpret that. And in the process, it's never quite accurate. And maybe we never knew the accurate way because we can't know everything in any particular time and place. So that, I think, comes down to the complication of history. You know, trying to make history is trying to determine, well, what is the thing? Even if we want it to be fair, what does that look like? And for most of us, we try to do something that's sometimes referred to as like just trying to make it equal, try to make it balanced. And the problem is we end up with false equivalencies.
That's
we
right.
say, we gave you 2 points, now give me 2 points. But the 2 points may not be equivalent, you know? It's like when people say, oh, let's meet in the middle. Well, if you start off that I should be your slave, we're not meeting in the middle, you know, because there's no middle for that. You know, if you start off with an absurd position, I'm not going to come into the middle of another with, you know, unless you allow me to take a completely absurd position like you should be my slave.
I guess they can be in the middle.
Another absurd position. And then we could come in the middle, but just, I started at what I think is the most reasonable thing, accommodating for how you feel and what you need. And then you started an absurd position. No, I'm not meeting you in the middle.
Well, and I can add something on that remembering part is that if you're looking back on something and using history or a historical figure or a historical quote or whatever it is, with a preconceived notion of what you want to be true,
Yes.
you already have a problem because you're going to look for what you want.
Yes.
And a good way to try to challenge that is to say, let me look for something that disproves what I think. And you can do that and still be fact-based. I'm talking about primary sources, historical stuff, because that will then at least help you see that there is more nuance to this issue. I guarantee you, whatever it is, that there is more nuance. I don't care what side you're coming from. Even Miss Joanne Bland, she was not an advocate for either political party. I could tell you that. You know what I mean? And she had critiques and positives for everything. Okay, so everything's a balance, plus and minus. As you point out, Lawrence, not always a 50-50, depending on what you're looking at, right? You have to have, but what I mean here is, forget our beliefs. I'm saying when we look at the documents, try to find something that shows otherwise, because I promise you that whatever you think, history probably disagrees.
Yes. Yep.
It's not that simple. It never is.
And I think that's why I like the scientific method. And part of that scientific method that says whatever you come out with is your theory. What would disprove your theory? What
Right.
conditions do
Right.
you need? And if you can't state that, then we can't accept it as a theory. You have to be able to say what set of events or what data could we introduce here that says, nah, this thing is not as solid as it's a little shaky. If you can't do that, we can't accept it. Sharon, you're going to say something with your mic on?
Mike.
Well, I like to see your lips move. Oh, there you go. Now,
There, my lips. Ravi, were your parents in Los Angeles during the Zoot Suit riots?
Oh, no, Zoot Suit's right. Not quite old enough for that.
Yeah.
Zoot Suit's riots were in the 40s, but my parents were not there. No, my parents came there in the 60s and 80s, respectively, separately.
Yeah.
Before they met, and then they met in the early 80s, and I was born in 84.
Oh.
November of 84.
the Zoot Suits go kind of way back, But we're actually coming up on the end of our program right now. And so I want to give Raffi a chance to make any kind of closing remarks, and also tell us where we can see your program too.
Sure.
Maybe you could
Yeah,
put that.
I mean, what's on my mind is maybe a good way to close. I mean, I love the line, whatever you think, history disagrees. I think I would, if you take away one thing, I would love for you to remember that. And I'll give you one example on that is my favorite, we were talking about earlier, some of my historical heroes, I have a bunch of them, but one of them that comes to mind that's really probably at the top of the list for me is George Wythe, W-Y-T-H-E. You may not have heard of him, but you can actually still find his home in Williamsburg, Virginia. George Wythe was a tutor for many people, but including Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall. And if you know anything about the early republic, Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall later went on to become major rivals. John Marshall being the first significant Chief Supreme Court Justice and Chief Justice Supreme Court, and really shaped a lot of the Supreme Court precedent that we still use today. And Jefferson, of course, at that same period, being president of the United States. And but they both learned from the same person, George Wythe. And Wythe was seen as so important by the Virginians that when the Declaration of Independence was signed over the course of weeks, like I said, not in that room, there are 7 Virginians that signed this. But George Wythe is the last one to sign, but the other 6 left the top line open for him, for George Wythe, because that's how highly he was looked upon. But here's why this matters. The same teacher taught 2 people that ended up to be really big time political rivals. That to me says the epitome of education right there, because he didn't just sit there and clone himself and proselytize, but he gave them the tools to be able to learn and analyze for the rest of their lives. And they went on their different paths of what they believed, both brilliant, both well learned. That's the kind of education that I'd like to see our challenge ourselves to. And I don't just mean in education institutions, but the way you approach something, the way you think about something, to keep George Wythe in mind, because that can happen. You can be learned and have two different or more, but in this case, two different perspectives that are both very equally informed. Now, where you want to find me, if you go to celebrityhistorian.com, I have a bunch of stuff on there, links that go off to some of my TV appearances, books. I have a class I teach, all kinds of things. So you can, that's the easiest way. You can also go on YouTube. If you look up the channel Celebrity Historian, I do post stuff on there, like my TV clips. When I do TV clips, like on those different stations that I mentioned, I do then get a clip and post it on there. And sometimes I put up some of my speeches there as well. I have a contested historic site speech up there that I did in Louisiana. So they're always customized locally, of course, but that's another way. And the last thing I'll say is, if you go to cleothemuse.tv/watch, you'll see my TV show on Apple TV. If you use that link, I can put it in here if you like. It's free. You don't need to log into Apple TV or anything like that. So if you go there, you don't need a subscription. But if you use my link, I just put it in there. And there I do interviews of people today, and they're from all walks of life, and try to find how historical themes connect to their present day. Those are three ways you could check my stuff out. But celebrityhistorian.com will send you to all of them if you just go there.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting conversation. Sharon, we ran out of time, but yeah.
You can email me, Sharon.
Yeah.
I
But
didn't mean it to be
but-
long, just a
All right.
quickie.
Okay, I thought you were going to say something.
Are you gonna say something or?
Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and show up next week too. It'd be same time, same station, and we'll have more fun than a barrel of monkeys. Okay, bye.